Hi. This video is a continuation of my blog, where I track the progress of my art journey, and was made instead of the usual text format to avoid the brick wall of text that was last year's attack summary. Armed with an aging tablet and a ratty microphone, we start off the month on July 2nd, because time zones. I digress. This month's first attack is a simple piece to ThatSebbyPerson of their kitty cat Sebbycat. And I say that this is simple because, well, I've done this pose a whole year ago, back when the cylinders were longer and the wrists were stronger. I chose this pose because, well, frankly, because I had a poor night's sleep and didn't want to try all that hard, but also because Sebbycat seemed like a chipper lad, and since I've only ever drawn powder cake smiling, I figured it'd be fun. And after fumbling around for an honestly embarrassing amount of time, seriously, wrist injuries are no joke, I was eventually hit with my first obstacle, the hair. I've only ever drawn center part hair, and the one exception, Dusk, has her hair still cleanly divided down the middle. Sebbycat's hair doesn't part in the center. I first tried just following the general shape of the image, but it looked terrible. Then I tried again, and then again, and god damn it, Sebbycat, you were supposed to be an easy start to the month. I eventually just gave up and drew a center part. But then I drew over the center part. This allowed me to, this allowed me to get a more pleasant overall shape for the hair. Yeah, it covers a fair bit of his eyes and it's quite messy, but considering that ThatSebbyPerson does the same, I'm just not gonna bother anymore with this stupid cat. But yeah, after the hair, everything was pretty much just standard fare. I noticed that Sebbycat has these lines that demarcate the boundaries of colours, so I decided to make that a bit more prominent here. These lines also aren't on the hair, which I guess is fair. There's a lot more happening with colours there after all. After tossing the ears behind the head, some shading and adjusting the left arm, our purple cat is done. Oh wait. There we go. Perfect. Even though Sebbycat was supposed to be a simple piece to draw, the hair ended up being quite an interesting challenge. A surprise to be sure, but I suppose it's quite the welcome to 2026. And I do like the design of Sebbycat. It's simple, but cute and silly. It's awesome. Now get this stupid thing out of my sight. Next attack I did was of Lushy's character Liang Liang. No, I do not know how to pronounce his name. And Liang Liang here is described as a lame OC, a chud, and a failed pianist and guitarist. And while I love characters who belligerently reside in the interstice of excellence and failure, Lushy also stated that their passion was never about art, living was enough beauty. That's really poetic, actually. So I'm drawing Liang Liang standing in a field of flowers. And very quickly I found out that drawing the flowers one by one would take forever. So I copy and pasted them, and you can already see that this is going to require a content warning for trypophobia. Whatever. Tree. Now that the scene was done, I moved on to the guy. Going into this, I already knew that drawing the head would suck. I've historically struggled with drawing furries without hair and the looking up angle. And lo and behold, it sucked. Drawing the head was a pain. So much so, at some point I just had to move on and do other things just so I could feel like this wasn't a lost cause. And, well, first I shrunk the head and oh wow, that actually looks better. Then I tried to work on the hair and eventually landed on something I'm willing to move on from. Then I played around with the ears and I'm just gonna let the time-lapse play out. I'm not happy with this. Usually when I draw something bad, I just go, oh, okay, that's bad, and then move on. But this is a drawing made for someone else, and I have just knowingly given someone a substandard piece. But there is still one important thing to learn from this. The head is too big. This is something I was vaguely aware of, but drawing someone who doesn't have many features on their head has made this really, really obvious. For the future, it needs to be proportionally smaller. After a less than a good night's sleep, I got started on the next attack. This piece is of Joopou's character Tarquis Bluteus, the commander of the gang. I was actually debating on whether or not to attack Joopoou, and looking back on this, I really shouldn't have. It's really obvious that she's way out of my pay grade. I mean, it's not hard to be when your art styles derive from all goddamn things Roblox. The pose is derived from an earlier piece commissioned by FMAT for their 2026 anniversary by Uni Shiroza, specifically the frontline one of Da Vinci shouting at a radio. And you are going to notice that my taking of other people's art and deriving from it is going to be a recurring occurrence. I started with just getting the shape of the bunker down. I thought having a flag would be a nice touch, but since Tarquis doesn't have a standard that represents his gang, I don't think, I just went with a fairly nondescript design. I also decided to make Tarquis shout into the radio and be leaning on the bunker edge, just so I wouldn't be totally ripping off uni. And a roadblock I encountered was the hat. That is indeed a hat, and looking back I struggled with that. I eventually got something that looked alright, but I'm not hugely fond of it. The ears were pretty simple, and so was the body. And for the radio, I just drew a brick. No, actually I removed it. It was too busy up here, and I figured this piece didn't really need a radio. It can just look like he's yelling at someone below. Once the line work was done, colouring and shading was just a procedural affair, and I also added these things to properly sell the shouting. A bit more finagling later, and we're done. Please ignore the fact the entire thing is on an angle. The second attack of the day was done to Voncamper of their Sona. I've actually been following the artist for a while, and I've always wanted to practice doing a perspective drawing. That being said, I recently commissioned a piece from Fire Eagle 2015, so although I didn't know anything about perspective drawings entering, and looking back at this, I still don't, I wasn't doing it totally blind. And I was immediately slammed with a roadblock in the form of the ears. These things are about as big as Voncamper's head, and when I first drew it out, it felt weird. So I just did the same thing I did in Passion and did other things, hoping it would solve itself. And as usual, this didn't work. Eventually I got one side down, but couldn't get the other side, so I just copy and pasted it. And I tried playing with the outline of the head, and I discovered that I'd forgotten about one huge issue. This cheek fluff isn't stylistic, it's necessary to make the outline of the head not just a circle. Thank God Voncamper comes pre-installed with 2 tufts of hair atop his cranium for such purposes. Yep, okay, I need to move on. I struggle with hands, and it's pretty obvious here, but this was a fun challenge. When I figured out how to make the shape of the hand look good, I physically recoiled. And then I remember still thinking it looked weird, so for want of better options, I copy and pasted the hand to the other side. I also remember having to physically lie down for a whole 10 minutes, because I was fully expecting to look bad. And it wasn't. This inspired great confidence in me, so much so that I tried drawing paw pads. Honestly, I didn't even consider drawing them entering this attack, and well, that's something. Then I copy and pasted it to the other side. Yeah, put Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V right below undo on the list of reasons to never switch off digital. I'll be honest, the pads look a little off, but at this stage I still have no idea how to make them look better. And funnily enough, I like this piece even less without them, so they get to stay. Into colouring, I found out that Voncamper's main fur colour is pretty much the same as my standard background shade, which is amusing but bad for obvious reasons. I also added in a blush because literally why not? I didn't do much on the 4th of July. It was Saturday, which meant band day, and I also had a birthday party that ended at 23:30, so I didn't bother putting on my wrist wraps. Huge bloody mistake, by the way. That being said, I managed to get one attack out in the morning. This is Kawa121's character, Fred. Fred is wearing glasses. Glasses equals cool. Explosions also equals cool. Bombs cause explosions. Therefore, bombs are the causes of cool. Fred with a bomb equals cool times 2. Attack done. Yep, your eyes indeed do not deceive you. Fred is in fact riding a bomb. The bomb was pretty easy. It's a fairly nondescript shell, but the glasses. Ugh, the glasses. I did my usual tactic of slamming my head against a wall until something works, and once I got something I was, willing to move on from, I moved to the muzzle, and instantly you can tell that this wasn't going to work. So, you know the drill. And at some point I just gave up and used the select tool to drag the entire thing up so it wouldn't collide with the head. And select. Don't forget the select. Fred has these tufts of hair that actually work great to break up the circle, and after a lot of fiddling, the head was done. Moving on to the body, Fred has pretty extensive chest fluff. I entertained the thought of drawing chest fluff with my resident fluffy cat, Anchor, but never really pursued it properly. First I tried just drawing it, but as usual it didn't work, so I used the only trick I have.
Let's go gambling! Aw, dang it! Aw, dang it! Aw, dang it! Aw, dang it!
Moving lower, I drew his coat trailing behind him to help convey that Fred is moving really fast. One tail later, and it was just the colouring and shading. I actually adjusted the chest fluff a bit to make it look like he was being blown back by the rushing wind. I'm not 100% on the teeth though, I just hope that Kawa121 thinks it's fine. I also made him laugh, since I thought it would help make this piece feel more chaotic. And yep, that's it. I didn't do any attacks on the 5th. Feel free to grab a drink or something to eat. This part is unedited and not scripted. It's, an intermission. Why not? I set the day aside to mostly recover from the previous night, but also to start work on putting together this video, and also because I left my tablet at band. Whoops. I also realized that I didn't actually secure any permission to use any of the artwork shown, except mine. I have permission to use that, obviously, so I private messaged everyone. I would like to make some addendums though. Passion is actually just fine. I understand why I hated it at the time, but it's not nearly as bad as I said it was. So is attacking artists who are better, and I wish I didn't kick up the biggest kerfuffle over characters with no hair. That's all. Intermission over. I'll be real honest, I didn't really put a whole lot of thought into what I was going to draw. I just saw the smug face and went, yep, Void Catgirl normal version is going to be wielding a bomb. This is CatGirlLivvy's character, Void Catgirl normal version. And yeah, you heard me, Void Catgirl normal version is going to be wielding a bomb. I started with the bomb, and at some point I just went, yep, that's a nuke. So a nuke it is. Moving on to the eyes, even though the design had... Moving on to the eyes, even though the design handles them pretty differently to how I handle them, I just went with my general process, then changed it slightly, planning to have a second pass at it later. After that was the hair, and great heavens, center part hair, oh is it a breath of fresh air to not have to worry there. Though similarly with the face, since the pose is fairly complex, I left it unfinished before I commit to any line work that would be difficult to reverse. The ears have this red thing happening behind them. I'm not actually sure what that is, so I just decided to deal with it by not dealing with it, hoping that it would solve itself. It didn't work. Done with the body, I loop back to the hair. Void Catgirl normal version has the hair parting across the shoulders. I have hair myself that does this, so I actually filmed myself doing this very jumping motion. As it turns out, the hair doesn't want to move behind the shoulders since, the shoulders are in the way, and instead fall in the armpits. Once I got something I was okay with, it was on to colouring. I already knew that colouring the hair would be the hardest part. It has extensive use of gradients, so I decided to tackle that first. Looking at the reference sheet, you can see that there's a fair bit of nuance as to how the gradients are applied, but I decided to just apply the gradient universally across the piece. After copying and pasting the solid colours, I reduced the opacity and then used the select tool to remove parts that weren't inside the bounds of the hair. The gradient layer actually ended up being a bit too much, so after some quick undoing, I squashed the colours to be thinner. Favourite tools. Absolute favourite tools. And, well, I'm not totally sold on the effect, but it is simply good enough. I also realised at this point the ears are coloured black. It's actually been a while since I last drew ears being demarcated from the hair, so it was a fun throwback to way back when. Continuing with the colours, this shade on the upperwear is so similar to the background shade that I actually had to darken the entire thing just so I could see what I was working with. But once everything was done, it was done. This next one is a little more experimental. This is newsun's character, Peanuts. You are encouraged to ignore the name. Now, I generally get the vibe that Peanuts is fairly chipper, and I also wanted to experiment with drawing over photos, so I thought it'd be funny if I drew him unaware that the door had a bomb. I just realized, as I'm recording right now, I didn't even realize that I did 3 consecutive bomb-related attacks. Whoops. Anyways, I won't have a lot to say about the drawing process of Peanuts since, well, I drew him before last Artfight. Since a fair bit of Peanuts will be obscured by the door in the image and the lower boundary, I didn't bother with drawing the parts that I knew would just be removed anyways. These lapels are kind of weird the way I drew them. It kind of feels like they're being cut off at the neck, but I chose not to worry about it. newsun draws his characters with fairly extensive cheek fluff, except Clarissa, but I chose not to draw that. This is because, well, I straight up just forgot how to draw cheek fluff in newsun style, so I drew the fluff how I would and hoped that it would be fine. Moving on to the colouring, I remember his face colours giving me quite a bit of trouble last year, and yeah, they're giving me trouble now. The central white ended up being too big, so much so that I had to nerf Peanut's smile just so I would be smaller. This part of the face, where the light grey is, I wasn't sure how to handle it. So I moved Peanuts' arm up so it would be covering that area and I wouldn't have to handle it. Yeah, the entire time I was drawing this, I felt like a child shoving their dirty clothes in the closet and calling their room clean. Peanuts would be half obscured by the door frame, and I wasn't sure how to approach doing this. What I ended up doing, having a second layer atop and using the select tool to remove the darker area, is definitely not the best way of approaching this, but I got there. Yeah. This next attack is also of another character I've done before. JohnApplewoof's character, Salvage. Salvage is a lizard prince who is described as having, like, heated lava poison spit, that he uses to weaken his enemies, and apparently also causes chronic pain. So why not? I decided to draw a simple piece of him spitting his poison. For the actual mouth, I wasn't sure if the spitting action would be more like a... I ended up going for the last one though, since the mouth would be opened the widest. The ears were fairly simple, but these protrusions on the side of the head gave me trouble before, and they're giving me trouble now. I couldn't get these things, I'm just gonna call them frills, to look okay, so I ignored them and hoped that it would fix itself. It didn't work, so I had to return to it after doing the horns. JohnApplewoof notably draws the frills as being behind the ears, and well, I'm really not satisfied with how they turned out at all. And really, all I can hope is that JohnApplewoof doesn't hate how I did it. This little thing on his forehead. In later drawings, these corners are squared out. I didn't last time, but I decided to this time. May as well follow the most current drawings of Salvage. Similar situation with the... that's not fur, so I'm just gonna say outer pattern. Salvage reference sheet has these extra details in the outer pattern, but he isn't usually drawn with it, so I decided to omit it as well. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The claws were pretty painful to draw. Usually I don't bother with drawing hands, but the claws are a pretty significant part of the design, so I kinda had to. What I landed on is literally only one claw visible. The tail was okay, and the spitball was fairly generic, and colouring and shading were pretty simple. The colouring of the spitball was actually approached fairly similarly to how I approached colouring my Sona, so that's kinda neat. I also added a slight shine to the dark orange part, since I think that's supposed to be a chitinous substance.
The next piece is definitely the most involved piece I've done thus far. This is H. Silly's characters, Atrox the King, Mutari the Jester, and Chartum the Secretary. Fun fact, Atrox is Latin for atrocious. I've been watching a bit of Skullmug recently, and when I saw a certain video, I grow bored of these. I went, yep, that's Atrox. And the other two would just be watching, shocked by the entire thing. They're not actually here for any reason, I just really like their designs. I started with a simple wireframe. This is meant to be a generic character, so I just drew an outline. Next up is Atrox, and he will be sitting on his royal throne, growing bored. I knew drawing Atrox would be tricky, but something I wasn't expecting to trip me up was his crown. This thing sits on the outside of his ears, and for some reason that was hard for me to do. The robes were especially difficult, since I wasn't really able to tell what was happening from the one image provided. I could have asked, but I didn't, since I already felt like PMing people for permission to use their art already felt like a lot. I assumed that this white thing was like a pelt that's thrown over the shoulders. The bat wings were also going to be a problem, but funnily enough, with how the throne is drawn, the wings don't have a lot of room to extend. At first I thought, great, I don't have to draw the wings. But since it's a pretty big part of his design, I at least had to make an effort. The stinger wasn't so bad though. I won't know of any other problems the line work has until I start colouring, so it was on to the other two. Mutari was going to be the easiest, so I did them first. Neither Mutari nor Chartum have Atrox's majestic mane, so making their heads look good was a fair challenge. This project was comparatively big, so much so by the time I moved on to Chartum, I knew that there wouldn't be enough layers left, so I split the project into two and drew Chartum separately. There's actually not a lot to talk about the line work of Mutari and Chartum, it's just a lot of trial and error. But as it turns out, I could have very easily fit Chartum in the original project, so I copy and pasted the layers in. I took a moment to have a lie down since I genuinely wasn't expecting it to look good, and then went to colouring.
Bonus Chartum fact. He and Equus are in a semi-canon relationship.
First up was His Majesty, and really, there's not a whole lot to talk about. I did the gradient trick though, so that's pretty cool. And moving on to the other two, similarly, there's just not a whole lot to talk about. Usually, I try to write at least dot points on what the script could be about, but I didn't for this one. It was just get it done, get it done, get it done. Have some silence while the time-lapse plays out. Oh wait, I do have something to talk about. Mutari's eyes are heterochromatic, and since the red one is partially obscured, it kinda doesn't look right. To make it look less weird, I added this thing where the top, bottom of the eyes are brightened slightly. I also added this to Atrox, and the gradient trick was done twice for Chartum. Once on his wings, the second on his head. The next attack is of a non-anthro character, TinnedtheTinCan's knight, Benedict. I had actually known what I wanted to draw him doing for a while. In Darkest Dungeons 2, in the Crusader's 4th Shrine of Reflection, he declares himself the winner, offers the warlord a mercy they both know he does not deserve. I won't go into detail about how this one particular event is just so badass, but Benedict's character permissions included not having him do anything heinous or horrible, and fighting can very easily be argued as such. Or he did. There's no longer such a clause forbidding such depictions, and TinnedtheTinCan has doubled down on Annika's man purse, so I interpret it as being open season now. And funnily enough, I do have a character who both wears armor and has a man purse. The process of drawing Benedict was very different, and I struggled a little, but I can't really talk about that and make it interesting, so I'll just gloss over that and instead focus on his armor. Benedict's helmet appears to be one continuous piece of metal. I'm not sure what this piece is atop. I suspect it's there for the same reason I added these lines to Enka's own armor. But overall, this does seem to be a great helm with no hinging visor. Though when I moved on to the shoulder plate, I knew that the head would be way too big and I risked deviating from the original design significantly. So I shrunk it down, and you can clearly see that I got really confused at how the head would attach to the torso. Moving back to the armor though, I went down the arms and, well, I also had some issues figuring out how to shape the individual segments of armor as the body bends, especially since Benedict's armor is different from anchors at the joints. Luckily, TinnedtheTinCan has provided a simple, elegant, and efficient remedy to cure my woes. Don't worry about it. I also appreciate how the hands are just circles, at least I don't have to try there. And how can I forget? The man purse. But honestly, I'm not hugely satisfied with how it turned out. I guess it's one of the best examples as to why I don't draw humans. It looks a little off. Onto the Warlord. I didn't know just how explicit I wanted the reference to Darkest Dungeons 2 to be, so I just drew the helmet except the plume and something generic for the rest of the armor. The coloring was dead easy. Benedict is literally 2 colors, and I ended up deciding to draw the hand. I also added a nice shine to his armor. The Warlord is fairly basic, but I thought that was okay. The focus isn't on him anyways. And I also decided to make a small scene of the place, because why not?
My cousins returned from holidays and are sleeping over at my house. And since I had just left behind what I considered to be a rather successful week and a bit, I took that as an opportunity to enjoy the rest of the holidays. This is not an exhaustion intermission, but rather a vacation intermission, a small personal reward for the fruits of my labour. Though that being said, since this intermission will probably last until the rest of the holidays, by the time the school term rolls around, the attacks will definitely slow down by a lot. Putting together this video takes forever, man. This will be scripted and lightly edited, so I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about a couple of things. I considered the title of a given piece, and to a lesser extent the caption, to be a part of it, and therefore important that I get it right. I've largely stopped giving my own pieces titles except for the 2 pages, and that was because it felt gaudy, especially since the target audience was exactly 1 person. I did keep the caption though. But since every attack is required to have a title, I had to put some thought into what to title them. There's not really a whole lot to talk about in terms of the captions. They're often a case-by-case basis, but if you'll entertain me, and I'm in a video you have no choice but to entertain me, how I approach titles can be split into 5 main categories. Trivial positives. Titles that needn't be pros, for it will add little to the work it is attached to. Silly Guy and Hugs falls into this category. I chose for these titles to be comparatively simple, as the works themselves were simple. Citations. Titles that directly reference something, and the caption often does too. Passion references Liang Liang's character description, and Mercy references Darkest Dungeons 2. I usually use these when the piece itself is directly derived from something, but in the case of Passion, it was a descriptor of who Liang Liang is, which added to the serenity of the work. Simple descriptor, exactly what it says on the tin. The title, as basic as can be, summarizes the content of the work. None of the attacks strictly adhere to this category though. The causa of cool sort of falls between this and citations, since I was referencing the script for this video. I wouldn't call it a strict citation though, since I feel like referencing my own work for a title is kinda weird, especially since causa of cool can very easily be its own standalone title. Facetious, titles that deliberately downplay the severity of the content by employing an element of humor. Professional Castigator kinda falls between this and simple descriptor. My line of reasoning pretty much just went, commanders yell at people. They do this a lot. It might as well be their job to yell at people. Harmless Prank, when it's obviously not. Shrewd Negotiator. Voidcat Girl, normal version, is wielding a bomb. Your terms are as follows. Do as I say, or I Wordplay. Titles that possess multiple potential interpretations of their meaning given the content of the work. These can either be puns or double entendres. Vitriol is one. Salvage is spitting a lava-like poisonous spit. Vitriol refers to venomous verbal criticism, and Salvage sure is spitting his poison. But vitriol also refers to sulfates, and they are often poisons. And what's coming out of Salvage's mouth? Yep, poisons. Dishonourable Discharge sort of falls between this and facetious. The jester is being killed, and that's certainly one way to discharge someone. But what is the jester dishonourably discharging? That's right, his blood. And one last thing before I bring this intermission to a close. I've noticed that I've been saying that I'm not fully satisfied with a given piece somewhat often, but naturally that begs the question, what has to happen for me to be happy with it? What will satisfy me? And, well, I haven't really been able to answer that. I don't know where I'm going with this, to be honest, but when I say I'm not satisfied, I'll at least try to justify why. And yeah, back to the summaries.
The next attack is on Cashreggister's character Dart and DucksEatBreads' character Isle. Dart and Isle are both guitarists, but that's not what got me to draw them. It's this thumbnail image, right here. Chud 1 and Chud 2. Chud 1 and Chud 2. The relationship between Dart and Isle is described as Chud 1 and Chud 2. And I can in fact think of 2 people in my life who both play the guitar and their relationship can be described as Chud 1 and Chud 2.
So what the hell? I'm gonna base these two chuds on the two chuds I know and have them jam together. One other thing though, Dart's guitar isn't actually depicted, and I can't really guess what he would play. I have zero guitar knowledge, so I asked the band what they think he would play, and who answers but Chud One himself. Starting off with Dart, his cheek fluff is noticeably quite jagged, so I drew it spikier than I perhaps usually would. Moving on to his, I think that's a hooded jacket. I had a little trouble getting it to look good, especially since, I'm not totally sure what it is. But that wasn't the main trouble I had with drawing Dart. Oh no, it was his shoes. I've never even entertained the thought of drawing feet as anything other than the final section of a cylinder, and I knew that if I drew Dart with more defined feet, I would have to do something similar with Isle too. But it is a big part of Dart's design, so it was pretty much mandatory that I made an effort. I'm not going to beat around the bush. First attempt was bad, adjusting went similarly. Second attempt was not much better, considered hearsing the entire thing, looked at how other artists approached it, and after a few more attempts landed on this. I'm not satisfied with it, and that's because it looks jank, like two tumors on the end of the legs. But this is my first attempt at drawing feet, and phenomenally, it doesn't look terrible. But after I sorted out everything else, I wrote myself a little reminder to return to the earring once I finished colouring, and moved on to Isle. Since Chud 2 has a tendency to become unresponsive when they start playing, I thought it'd be funny if I made Isle be so focused that he doesn't notice that Dart is trying to get his attention. Isle's cheek fluff is very rounded, especially compared to Dart's, so I drew it as usual and rounded out the edges. He also has these whiskers that, oh wait, I forgot about Dart's guitar. Okay, busted up Fender Stratocaster. I just drew the outline, moved the arms around a bit, and decided to do the rest once I moved on to colouring. Isle's guitar is actually pretty similar, then I ended up messing with the arms wireframe for a while before deciding that, yes, what I had before was fine actually. The rest of Isle's line work was alright, and then was on to colouring. Since I knew it was going to be the hardest, I coloured both guitars first. I'm not too worried about being totally accurate with the frets and strings, since that's just a route to insanity. And after a while, I think I got something that looks pretty alright, but this is meant to be banged up. I got something that's, well, not exactly convincing wear and tear, but you can tell what it's supposed to be. The colours of Isle's guitar are given though. I also only drew 5 strings because I physically struggled to fit the 6th in. Colouring in the two were fairly simple affairs, and so was shading. I found that having the top of the eyes darker looks better than having the bottom brighter, though I'm kind of hesitate to do this given that it's pretty obvious I have no idea what I'm doing here. Isle's guitar pickguard is coloured similarly to the whites of his fur, and with the Stratocaster, Dart's guitar body is coloured similarly to his fur. This wasn't intentional, but it's a fun parallelism between the two cats and their guitars. I'm still not 100% on the feet though, but for my first attempt, I think it's alright. May as well draw them in future pieces. Can't hurt to try. After a very hectic first week, I attacked WaKa's Rata, Armor. I'm not entirely sure of Armor's lore, but she has a satchel and is part of a team, so I figured that drawing her exploring a ruin or dungeon or whatever would be fine. I had never drawn anything with a distinct source of light, so I thought it'd be a good way to learn how to. After struggling with the face a bit, the ears were an interesting challenge. They're round, but not perfect circles, and they are demarcated from the hair, but in a way that actually looks more natural. By having the hair push into the volume of the ear, and more importantly, past it, it looks more like the ears are poking out of the hair. The body line work was fine, except the breasts. I struggled with that, and I chose not to draw distinct feet as I planned to have them cropped out. After fiddling with the hands for a bit, I got to work on the torch. This thing atop is pretty ugly, and I did end up changing it later, but it's going to be obscured by the fire anyway, so I chose not to worry about it. Moving on to the background, I did a brick wall pattern by first drawing a grid and erasing every other line. I initially started on doing the entire length of the canvas, but then I realized that that's stupid. Colouring was unnoteworthy. I wasn't too sure how to approach the ears, but WaKa does these 2 lines to give it depth, so I chose to copy that. The fire on the torch is not really convincing, but it's still serviceable. It's just like Gaussian blur applied to 3 vaguely fire-shaped volumes. You can tell what it's supposed to be. Shading was interesting since I'm working with a distinct light source. I also chose to shade a bit more aggressively than I usually would. I have no idea how to approach making it look like it's really dark though. I first tried drawing 1 light yellow circle for the torchlight and several black circles for the dark, fill bucketing and applying Gaussian blur to... oh. Wow, that... Okay, change of plans. The shoes are going to be barely visible but still visible, so I need to make an effort to draw feet. I also considered adding something in the dark, but I honestly think it would detract from the piece if it would. It's quite the vibe already. This is ClusterBomb's character, Ant. This is the Holy Grenade of Antioch, snuffing the rabbit of Carbonot. This is the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch on Ant's reference sheet. You can probably see where I'm going with this. I had exactly one option for what to draw Ant doing. Smiting his bitter enemy, bunny.png. I took an honestly embarrassing amount of time getting the wireframe to look good. I didn't exactly have a solid idea of what Ant was going to do at the time. Yes, your eyes do not deceive you, he will be elbow dropping a bunny. I also had some trouble figuring out the head shape, but I think I got something that looks alright. For some reason, I decided that the torso was going to be all one single layer, but it was otherwise unnoteworthy. The legs though. In the ref, the boots are noticeably larger than the pants section of the legs, but the boots themselves don't look like they're shin high. I chose to interpret it as a stylistic feature of ClusterBomb's art style, and assumed that the boots wouldn't actually take up half the legs. I then spent way too long trying to figure out how to draw feet, and almost gave up entirely too. Yeah, I have no idea what I'm doing. Way too much time later, and I had something that's barely different from what I usually do, but I had to move on, I'll be stuck on this for forever. Moving on ended up being the cloak, and well, I've never seen anything like this before. Usually cloaks are collarless and are secured around the front, but this is collared and is secured on what I think is the shoulders. Dealing with the collar was simple. I didn't because I don't, but even with that, I still had no idea how to approach this, and it shows. But after a while, I think I got something that looks alright. And once I moved on to coloring and shading, finally something was easy. That being said, I was drawing this at band at the time and therefore wasn't exactly focused on drawing, but I digress. The boots had a cross on their sides, but since most of the shoes are obscured by the pants, a simple yellow stripe would be fine. Shading was unremarkable, and I also gave the parts that would probably be metal a bit of a shine. The piece was unexpectedly challenging, but it was so much fun to draw. Certainly helps that Ant is literally just a bomb. The next attack is of someone 620's character, Nico. A clown and acrobat who does a lot of high-up stunts. Me personally, I'm not really that well versed in high-up stunts, so I pretty much just went on Google and yep, that's the one. That pose looks alright. How hard can it be? Okay, that was harder than expected. As per usual, first up was the head. Going into this, I already knew that drawing the head would suck. I've historically struggled with drawing furries without hair and the looking up angle. And lo and behold, it was actually fine. That's not to say that there weren't hardships. The ears are cleanly separated from the head, which makes my usual approach largely unviable, and the fluff details are very round, and it took a bit to figure out how to make it look good. I even have to flip the canvas. Oh my god, why have I not been doing that all this month? But to my bemusement, I didn't have a night-long crash out about it. I mean, I did, but for something completely different. Moving on. Nico has a super long tail, and I'm not entirely sure how having a tail would work with a high rope act like this, but I decided that it wasn't worth worrying about. Speaking of things not worth worrying about, I don't even want to talk about the hands and feet. These sucked. The colouring was uneventful, and I added the star mark, and it is done on the side Nico is facing away from because I suck at drawing stars, and not because I knew that the hair tuft would collide with the mark and I would have to spend 20 minutes making micro adjustments to the line work if I didn't. The ears were pretty easy, it was just a grid. And before I moved on to shading, I decided to make a simple background, just to help make it look like Nico's performing or something. Though with the shading, I didn't even bother to consider how two sources of light would affect shading. And yep. This will be the last attack, and that's out of necessity. 1, I have to finish editing this video, and 2, I can feel myself losing it. This attack is of Flurriko's character, Ida Zertek, and Stella Weller's character, Kyle. I thought it'd be fun if I had these two otherwise disconnected characters interact with each other, and what better way than an online interaction on a certain platform. Yep, I'm redrawing the POV "you're just a little hater" meme. Their inclusion was pretty straightforward. Ida is described as loving feeling superior. Kyle is here because he's angry. But one thing before I go into it, character permissions. Ida said to not ship her with a male. I'm still not entirely sure on what shipping means exactly, but since it's a literal online interaction with zero implication that the two would know each other, let alone are in a relationship, I assumed it would be fine. And Kyle's permission said to draw his SH scars. I didn't want to because I'm a coward. I decided to do the poses before the framing. First up was Ida, and her pose wasn't referenced from, the meme I'm drawing, but from a gif of all things, the boy kiss a cat. Kyle's wireframe was just referenced from the meme though. I wasn't sure how to feel about these wireframes though. They kind of look weird. That being said, these are perspective drawings. I'll only know if they have problems once I start the line work. I knew Ida's hair would be challenging. She has straight hair, and when I used curves as a substitute for actually good line work, being made to forego them was an issue. I knew what I landed on wasn't that great, but I had to move on to the body before I could properly finish it. Ida has really pointy ears, so I pretty much just drew 2 shark fins on top of her head. I don't remember why I made them lean to the right, but I think it looks better like that. Drawing the body was okay, though I deviated from her design a fair bit.
I struggle with drawing boobs. You really think hips are on my radar?
Next is the hands. Do I really need to say anything? There's only so many ways I can say I struggle with hands, but once I was done with that, it was on to Kyle. Kyle's hair. I spent 30 minutes repeatedly trying to draw the hair, then I went to sleep, woke up and did it on the first try. I don't even know why I fuss so much about if they're gonna be hidden behind the ears anyways. Next up was the hand and body, and wow is it obvious I have no idea what I'm doing. I honestly don't even remember what happened, but yep, this truly is something I did. I have well and truly passed the point of scripting where I don't care anymore. But after fiddling with the line work a bit more and a cheeky canvas flip, it was on to colouring. On Kyle, I wasn't too sure of how the ears would interact with the hair. I did the thing I found 3 attacks ago, but it looks a little weird at this angle. I tried my usual, but that looked worse, so I just stuck with what I had. With Ida, the main challenge was her eyes. Her eyes are said to be yellow, but 1, the reference sheet doesn't show that, and 2, when I tried it looked weird in a way I can't describe. I chose not to worry about it though. These eyebrows are also really hard to see. First I tried making them white, but now they're too attention grabbing. What I did instead was, instead of having eyebrows just a line, they're ovals that I can colour in. I've seen other artists do this before, but I stuck with lines at the time, since I didn't know why people would pick oval over the line. But this might be a reason why. But since I went with the ovals on Ida, I had to go back and add it to Kyle too. The GUI was just traced. There is a specific commandment about tracing, but looking at it, tracing the GUI of a social media platform seems to be fine. I chose that trying to be creative with their display names and usernames would be a mistake, especially if I get it wrong, so they're both just their names. With their profile pictures, I just picked a prominent part of their designs. For Ida, it was her eyes, and it just ended up being her head, and for Kyle, it was the skull and his pants. I just drew a simple background that's similar to the meme tweet. I considered colouring it, but I didn't, and after the shading, that was it for the month. But I still had to figure out who of the 2 attacks would be assigned to. Heads for Ida, tails for Kyle. I don't really know how to end this. I'm going to sleep.